It was a nice discussion, actually. And as to the first question, most of the people said, well, there is not a real additional role for laws to regulate exhibitions. We already have all kinds of ethical guidelines, and they may suffice. And the advantage of ethical guidelines is that they have a certain flexibility. Laws are more fixed, and so it may be sufficient to have ethical guidelines. But, and then we discussed NECPRA as an example of a law that also has something to say about exhibiting human remains, for example, but also about repatriations. But in the United States, of course, the repatriations are within the nation. Whereas in the Netherlands, in our context, it is about restitutions most of the time to other countries. So there may be, it may be fruitful to also have a law in the Netherlands, or a statute or a decree regulating restitution. And at the present moment, we only have an ethical framework, of course, that is implemented now by the Commission Colonial Collections. But in Belgium, there is a law on restitution with a different framework and with advantages and also disadvantages. But it may be worthwhile to explore whether that also would make sense for the Dutch context. There is also a downside to legal solutions because they can be very bureaucratic or burdensome for claimants. You need expertise, money, and all kind of support to bring claims, etc. Then the second point, the role of law in exhibiting objects. So should you pay attention? Do you need to pay attention to the legal histories of objects? And the answer was yes in our session. It should be critically represented, so you should be clear about the legal histories and also the violence within these legal histories. So we were also talking a bit about the presentation by Elsbeth and Harman, who both talked about the way a neutral exhibition also neutralizes, let's say, the legal violence behind the acquisition of many objects dating from the colony, coming from the colonies. So you should pay attention to these legal histories to enable visitors to critically assess the role of law in the acquisition of objects. That was one point. And another point was you should also pay attention to the legal traditions of the people the objects were taken from, with maybe different legal traditions than let's say, the dominant colonial legal framework. And that is often still missing. So if you only pay attention to, let's say, the European legal history, you still miss out on the legal ideas and traditions of the people the objects originally belonged to. And that would be also a mistake to not pay attention to these other legal traditions. Yes, that was more or less what we discussed in half an hour, and then the time was running out. So,
all right, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Peter. Can you?
Yeah, thanks. I think the first point that came up in our discussion on the ethics of display and exhibition making is that it's an illusion to look for one-size-fits-all solutions, and this has to do both with the the kind of relationships that are concerned. I'll get to that more in detail in a moment, and to the time involved. So first of all, you can continue using the word communities, but what if you're looking for voices that haven't been heard yet, and you're combining those into a network that has so far not come together. Then you have difficulty sort of defining the community in any coherent way. And in temporal frameworks, a similar thing works. If you, as was already discussed, asking and answering a question, as Amber I think said, may take a very long time, and you need to make time for that, and that already affects the way you look at the relationships concerned. Because, as Joe mentioned, it's never a one-off. It's building a relationship and maintaining a relationship. It cannot work in the way capitalist contracts are signed, as is often thought in the case of informed consent, right? Where a signature of the interlocutor is enough to sort of transfer the ownership of the data to the researcher, which is not the kind of attitude that, for instance, ethnographers usually adopt. If we then relate that to a past, which of course is again about relationships, then there was mention of trying to come to terms with the past in different ways, for example, by drawing out forgotten stories. And if those stories are painful, or if they generate different views, right? Pride in a colonial past, for example, in certain Dutch cases that we know of. This again depends on finding answers in specific context, and therefore in very specific institutional ways of working to create an exhibition. So the question would become, why do you do this exhibition? And the answer would be always contingent and based on a specific context. It would imply a form of transparency that also includes being clear about the processes that led to an exhibition, so that that becomes part of the exhibition. I think Joe captured again the sort of the relationship between curator and audience in a nice way by saying that we've in his own case, we built the frame of the teepee and the community provides the canvas, right? And they fill it up with the canvas. So there is a necessity for the different parties in the relationship if you are to maintain the relationship, but it does require a very radical reconfiguring of authority. That is obviously, as we speak, going on. And there is no template for that reconfiguring because the relationship in the past was different, right? And here we also briefly discussed how different it would be to compare settler colonialisms to, for instance, later versions, forms of colonial mandates given to European powers and things like that. And to me, that is a way of saying that it is important, as I tried to put it at the beginning of our discussion, to treat expert and audience, or curator and audience, not as separate entities, but as a relationship, and to regard both of them as communities that need to be engaged with in order to make this reconfiguration of authority happen. And this can have very strange kinds of mixes, as we, for instance, know from the Faro Convention on Heritage, where the dominant principle seems to be that the heritage community is the expert, which is an interesting, leaves all kinds of heritage experts I've seen in a kind of quandary. What am I then here for? So, okay. Going back to the past again, this would be the final point. What violence cannot be shown, what has to be shown. How does that engagement with the past, which is necessary to maintain a relationship in a different way, with a different kind of configuration of authority. Well, here I think the discussion also had too little time and too many different examples to be able to come to some kind of clear answer to that question, but there were several points made. In whatever context, purely displaying white guilt, making an exhibition of very, very dark times just to emphasize those dark times and how bad colonialism is, usually doesn't work, or is not the best way to try to draw an audience. And this has a lot to do with something I found myself to be important to look at, is that there is a hidden history of museum displays that is commercial and built on spectacle, and it has all kinds of nasty pasts in it, such as displaying, live people. But that doesn't mean we can't forget about the commercial side of museum display and how it can determine exhibitions. And that in itself gives, I think, an important ethical principle, that there is reason to be wary of those commercial incentives, just as much as that there is reason to be wary of being too much of the teacher who tells the audience what to do, right? So that other kind of expertise is also not what we seem to be working with now. And clearly the idea that you only address one audience with the finger raised when you educate them about how bad colonialism is also balanced by another possibility that just working with a source community might also not generate the kind of story that in the end discusses a relationship, again, depending on why you have an exhibition, for what purpose. And one interesting thing to think of here is what happens when you want to make an exhibition about something that you don't have a collection of. And here several examples came to mind. One of them is the case of the Museum of African American Culture and History, where Lonnie Bunch started without any collection whatsoever. They had to make it, and that raises the question of what kind of work goes into that creation of a collection. The second one I had to think of was Barbara Kirschenblatt's engagement with the Polish Museum of the Museum of Polish Jews in Warsaw on the site of the erased ghetto, which also started without, in fact, what they found in the ghetto were, I think, 2 or 3 files of paper in a forgotten cellar. That was about it. And so again, they had to recreate a collection, but importantly, by emphasizing the kind of futures that Polish Jews saw in front of them before the Holocaust, which were completely erased by the Holocaust, and which, as we know from Holocaust museums, are not on display in those Holocaust museums usually as well. So their way was, their interesting contribution was to produce new futures, or the past futures again. And this is something that Wim Manuhutu referred to by pointing out that this is also what happens in the recent exhibition on the indigenous peoples living in Manhattan at the coming of the Dutch, where you recreate stories that for a long time have not been in circulation.
I can start with a question to you all. So, Vonu earlier this morning, but also in the ethics question, presented a set of projects that she was doing with diasporic communities. And we spoke in the last session about the relationship between settler colonialism and imperial colonialism, and what are the differences and overlaps. My question there would be, what is the role that diasporic communities play in relationship to museum practice, in relationship to communities who still live in the countries of origin? And what are the kinds of power balances, economic differences, logic also epistemic and privilege logic? Because I know from the Maroons from Jamaica who live in England, they always go back to Jamaica to tell Jamaican Maroons how to do things, because that's what they learned in England. So what is the ethics of that relationship is one question that I want to ask. And then my second question, coming from Peter's presentation, was an excellent article by Ross Poole about the ethics of memory. And one of the interesting things that I was thinking as you spoke about what we need to do in terms of the ethics of display is also an ethics of remembering atrocity, right? And what is that ethical framework that we do it? And in doing that, he, in Ross's, but also Paul Ricoeur, he also frames that around the relationships of who is the citizen. How do we understand the minority citizen or minoritized citizen in a country like the Netherlands, for example? And therefore, isn't there a legal protection for a minoritized person who should not have to go to a museum and hear certain stories because their citizen's rights say to them that a museum should not be anti-Semitic, or a museum should not be racist, or a museum should not be whatever? So is there a way in which the museum articulates with a legal right of the citizen to protection that says that museum cannot tell certain stories because it perpetuates continued violence on those citizens as opposed to other citizens? Walter looks at me with confounding, so saying, what the hell is he saying? You want me to explain it differently, or you have an answer? All right. So those were my little questions. Do I have the same rights as other citizens, I'm asking?
Maybe, can I respond first? So, very brief response only to this last point, because I don't feel really able, I'm not really the one who can answer the other questions, perhaps. So, but if the last question is also about the role of the law, again, also in displaying objects and exhibitions. And I think it is very important to address the role of the law also in the taking of objects and also in the history of the museum itself, in order to include peoples, minorities, or everyone in the Netherlands then, if the museum is in the Netherlands, and perhaps even outside, to include them as legal subjects. And you can only include them as legal subjects if you acknowledge their exclusion in the colonial past. And that is also a reason why I strongly believe that law should have an important role to play in any answer to the colonial past, because you cannot respond to legal exclusion by ethics or morality alone. You should also have a legal answer. You should answer legal exclusion in the end by legal inclusion. And that's where you need the law in the exhibition, by paying attention to these exclusions and then by welcoming everyone as being legally included in the community, or with that promise. And if you don't do that, you perpetuate these exclusions. And then you make also the museum itself still as an exclusionary place. So yeah, that would be my first response, if I have understand you correctly.
No,
Understood you correctly, sir.
Peter? And anybody else, it's fine, we're open.
I'm not sure that I agree with you there, but that's maybe beside the point.
This is what we wanted. Come on, let's hear it.
What your point makes me think of is the classical distinction in especially the anthropology of citizenship between legal and cultural citizenship, which has been there as long as the nation state exists, right? So it's sort of built into certain mechanisms of the nation state, which, the slip of the tongue was not purposeful, but it was correct, right? It is, nation and race are co-constituted. So there is a structural side to nation states that involves them in making racist or quasi-racist decisions towards certain groups of people. That's, and I'm just because that's been the case since the rise of the modern nation state, doesn't mean that it has to be like that always, because the nation state is a contingent construction and therefore, as a historical construction, can be changed, but not just like that. So what this tells me about the relationship between the law and the museum is basically that you will always have a discrepancy between the law as it is established on the nation-state scale as opposed to institutions that are not necessarily based on the nation-state scale but are paid from national funding, such as this museum or the Tropenmuseum. And as we well know, the different museums that are part of the Wereldmuseum have these different local roots that also make the museums different. That means that in relation to the discussion we had about the ethical side of things, this means that they all work from different templates. Contingent templates that have formed in sometimes the very recent past, sometimes a little bit longer past, and that means that you always have to work with what is possible in their particular context, as we discussed during the ethical session. And to me, that means that you know, the museum might just as well run ahead of the law than that it tries to make the law do what it has promised ever since Article 1 of the Constitution was written, and to which obviously the nation state itself has never completely adhered, except for certain groups of people. So I think here we're dealing with this variety of this, the time we need for caring for relationships, and there is a temporal discrepancy between the Article 1 of our Constitution and what we would want to happen in the cultural sphere, of which museums obviously are one of the constitutive parts.
Yeah. Thank you, Suzanne. I should run. All right. I actually, when you say that, that was kind of something that Tony Bennett was trying to deal with in the article about that second article after the exhibitionary complex. He was trying to get to a part of what you were saying. That, yeah, Suzanne.
Yeah, Actually, I get excited because we are discussing nation state, legal, whatever in the Netherlands. We are European nation, and we are working in a digital domain that even has no borders. And so for me, it's too easy to say, NAGPRA, yeah, of course, it's an issue within the USA. We have Norway with the Sami people. We have many other examples. Why do we not campaign that these type of laws are European laws applicable in the Netherlands, with all the effects that it might have in relationship to former colonies? And I mention it because we are currently preparing a meeting in the Peace Palace, also partly in the context of pressing matter, to discuss this on a European scale. And if we keep talking about the Dutch law, this and that and such and so, and who are the minorities and who are the migrants and who are the whatever, then we keep sitting in this trap of what you call the nation state as a contingent, I don't know what. Let's make it bigger. We have all the preferences, if you are a Dutch person, of being a European citizen. Let's take that responsibility also for our museums.
But Suzanne, I want to hold Suzanne to that little point, and then I think we could move to one question on the digital. But Suzanne, no, you can stay right there, because Suzanne, one of my worries would, so one of the nice points that also came out was a kind of one could call it an ethics of the temporal, an ethics of the prior. So one of the questions that was coming out was, what does it mean to be the Polish Jew prior to the Holocaust, right? Or what does it mean to be indigenous peoples prior to colonialism? And if we were to engage with that priorness and as a temporal question, then that leads us to other possibilities. But if you were to make the claim, Susan, or I should ask you, if you are to make the claim for taking indigeneity serious on the European context, does that not also pose a threat in this rising moment of exclusionary politics, that some other people will use the idea of indigeneity as their claim to Europeanness as well? That not the Sami will use indigeneity as their claim to priorness, but that there are other people in the nation state, European state, that will say, but we are prior as well. Is there not a risk in making it a European question in that way?
Well, we have to address that question. The Sami, they are clear. They say everybody who speaks Sami is a Sami. So there is not something like indigeneity or whatever. It's language and culture. The Roma and the Sinti, they say we travel through Europe and we claim our right to travel through Europe. So there are also these movements that we need to support. And if it's always the nation state that defines the laws to which you abide, and it's the European law that actually gives you more room for maneuver, then you keep this working from that privileged position. And if people think that they can use this discourse to strengthen their privileged position, well, then we have even more work to do.
And thank you, Suzanne. You are demanding of us, I think, to also what Arturo Escobar would say, think with the possible possibles, that there are other possibilities of imagining what a world could look like. And those come from indigenous peoples across Europe as well. Katja, I want to throw the last question at you and then we have to stop. Sorry for this. But I wonder if in the group with the digital, does the digital also allow us a possibility to rethink the bordering that Susan is speaking about? Is the digital also opens the possibility of not so being grounded to the nation state as an idea? Of course, there is the racist AI, but is there an AI that is also more spacious, capacious in helping us to imagine other borderings or border possibilities?
Well, I have my own reflections on that. I cannot speak for the group, but I had to think about that when Suzanne was saying that. I think this is rather, well, it's not very positive, my assessment of this, because it's also the role of software companies. So, and also, whom do we give our data to once we work with these tools? Who owns the cloud? Where do these data go? What do we need to take into account in terms of ownership? And that's, of course, crossing borders, but we are not very aware which borders, what is crossing and where a company is situated, like the big data companies. So then, like, of course, economy has a big role here, but I think that's rather something that I would be worried about. So which like kind of worms do we open if we think of these open like global data policies, even if, of course, there's all these positive things of like everybody can reach. We were thinking of doing like part of the exhibition digital so that we could like offer access to communities of origin by just like putting things online, which is nice. But of course, if we come to big data and AI, I rather see the problematic aspects. Sorry to end on this.
Thank you for ending on a low note. But that is why we're here. But anyway, thank you all, and thank you for the discussion. As we said, the reason for this, so we'd love you to send in other ideas. The reason for this is to try and provide some framework for how the museums can work in the future. So what are the considerations as a kind of manual for how we think through some of these questions that we've discussed today. Thank you for interlocutors until the next